Wolfram is a lawyer currently looking at different aspects from society, but was originally, he trained after gymnasium as a carpenter, but then changed gears and studied law at the University of Vienna. Afterwards, he was teaching and an assistant at the TU Vienna, and then in 2006, he started his own law firm in Vienna. And most people will probably know him from the case against Facebook. He supported Max Schrems. And last year, he changed from looking at data and data protection to also looking at climate litigation. And his team, together with a team of climatologists and an NGO, they put in a claim against the Brazilian government and Bolsonaro at the International Criminal Court to protect the environment and to prevent further destruction of the environment. So today, Wolfram will talk about what is climate litigation and also show us some example of his current projects he's working on. So Wolfram, the stage is yours. Please share your slides. And as usual, we'll have the talk first. And then if people have questions, they can add it in the chat and we will try to answer most of the questions after the talk, which will be around 30-35 minutes, I think. I think you have to unmute yourself, Wolfram.
So thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change litigation, which is quite a new phenomena in the area of legal practice. And for starting, I will talk a little bit about climate change as we are watching it, because climate change is already happening, and climate change, if still some see it as alternatively factual, we have to recognize and understand that we live on a planet with finite resources, and this planet doesn't allow unlimited economic growth. It requires us.
Wolfram, do you want to put yourself in presenter mode? You're on the.
Yeah, that's easier. Sorry. Thank you. So. Just sorry. The planet and the climate change requires us to take responsibility beyond our own national borders. And of course, we have to understand as well that mankind now is capable of making our planet uninhabitable in a short time. Besides the current danger of war in Ukraine, climate change is the biggest threat we have at the moment, and climate change is real and it is man-made. And if we fail to curb global warming, the consequences will be catastrophic. So if you look at Austria particularly, you can see that Austria is very hard hit, which is a result of the existing topography. Climate, fauna, flora in our country is extremely sensitive, and the consequences of inaction that we see on the global level or on Austrian level are serious and a burden for the future generations. However, the climate change is already affecting Austria now, and in the field of agriculture, forestry, tourism, but also in our ability to use renewable energy sources, we are hit very hard, even nowadays. Climate change means, among many other things, species extinction, more flooding, landslides, melting glaciers, heat waves, worse storms, and we've seen the landslides last summer and the flooding in Germany. We've seen the heat wave, the heat storm in Western Canada. Massive damage in agriculture, forestry, damage to investments such as heat, damage to roads, buildings, loss in tourism. Climate protection is part of environmental protection and human protection. If you try to break down the consequences for economy and the overall costs, there has been a report, so-called COIN report, Costs of Inaction report in 2015, just for Austria. And the calculation you see on the right part of the slide shows us that even this year we will have about 1 billion euro of average costs of market damage and non-market damage. And up to the years 2016 to 2045, it will rise to overall damage just in Austria about 2 billion euro a year, and from 2036 to 2065 they calculate with a damage of about 4 billion a year, which is real massive. And of course, whenever we talk about damage, we talk about law and who will be responsible for that and who will have to pay at the end of the day for this damage we are facing. In the next slides, I just give you a short overview over the political measures and political treaties that have been taken. And it started quite early that the world recognized, the United Nations recognized that we are facing a problem and that we will have to do something against climate change. And it was in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and when the countries committed first time to limit or reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, especially CO2. EU member states at that time targeted a reduction of 8%, and actually this first treaty was then overwhelmed by the Climate and Energy Package 2020 in EU, which was enacted in EU legislation already in 2009, where there was an agreement on a cut of greenhouse gases of 20%, and that EU energy should turn over to renewable energy 20% and improve the efficiency of energy for 20% as well. We had the COP21, so the Conference of the Parties, the 21st Conference of the Parties in 2015, the so-called Paris Agreement. And of course, in last November, you will be aware of the fact that we had the Glasgow Climate Pact in November 2021. All these agreements and all these pacts, and you can read it on the slides after my talk this afternoon, we have to see and understand that most of the countries are missing their targets, and Austria misses its targets as well. So if you just look at the year 2017, after reducing the emissions in the years before, we had an increase of 4.6% compared to Kyoto base. And this was not what we are supposed to do, of course. And still, Austria is missing the targets of Kyoto and Paris and is not on the line or in line with its responsibilities and is not complying with the agreements, is failing to comply the agreements. Austria therefore risks proceedings and penalties, proceedings at the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, or at the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, if we are breaking the treaties in the European Union, we might get penalties as well, which at the end of the day, we would have to pay as we are the society. I don't know, but I'm quite sure that you're aware of the fact that there is the existence of a climate change performance index, CCPI. And I had a look at the newest report of this climate change performance index, and it gives Austria a damning report card, actually. Austria's greenhouse gas emissions are at a very high level still, and are even rising. Per capita energy consumption is extremely high in the comparison with the other EU member states. You can see it on the right card, on the right side of the slide. All the countries which are in the color green, they are in a good way, but all other countries, yellow or orange or red, are on a rising or on an extremely consumption high level. From the point of the view of the reporters at the Climate Change Performance Index, there are no effective domestic climate policies noticeable in Austria. And even if we have historically an expansion of hydropower, this is a long time ago when we started that already, and we did not invest a lot in climate protection in the last decade. So Austria, even if you only look at the renewable energies such as wind and solar, Austria is still far behind in comparison with other countries. So we're only ranking down there somewhere on the 37th level of the whole report, which is not really amazing. Even states like China or less developed states are way better in their means and measures to climate protection. So actually, this might be the answer for you already, why we need climate change litigation. If one contrasts the political agreements and the commitments, we actually, with the actual developments, one finds that many countries, including Austria, are still far from complying with the agreed measures. And it makes little sense from my point of view to set ever more ambitious targets for ever shorter periods of time if they are not also linked to concrete map measures and the latter are then actually implemented. It therefore seems necessary to increase the pressure on those politically responsible and on those parts of the economy that refuse to make their contribution or even continue to make profits with climate damaging actions. If you want to define climate change litigation, you have to be aware of the fact that this is not a legal term actually so far, which is in common use. Climate change litigations, of course, deals with legal disputes about laws, acts, or omissions in connection with climate change mitigation and adoption of measures. Such legal proceedings or procedures are of particular importance in the United States, Australia, where the term climate change litigation comes from. And it can be named more briefly climate litigation, and it has become established with reference to the Anglo-American legal sphere, the common law, but also beyond in the continental legal sphere, and even in Europe, if we talk about procedures at various courts, nowadays we talk about climate change litigation. In German-speaking countries, you can find the term Klimaklage or Klimaschutzklage, which is also used, and mainly you will find it, of course, in journalistic texts. When you turn to legal expertise at the legal texts, you will find it in the specific way of the term, like Individualantrag, Menschenrechtsbeschwerde, or other. So the word climate refers to connection, of course, with climate protection and adaptation. The ways of climate lawsuits or climate change litigation are various and different ones. Of course, you can think about filing lawsuits against a company at civil courts. You will have lots of administrative procedures or proceedings at administrative courts or constitutional courts or international courts, as we did at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, or of course default cases at European Court of Human Rights or European Court of Justice. What all these climate change litigation has in common is that it is using law as a tool. It is using law as an instrument and thus referring cases to courts to make non-negotiable decisions to protect nature and the environment. And it's still a comparatively new but powerful tool. I would like to point your interest to the German Constitutional Court landmark ruling in May 2021. This ruling said that if we infringe the right for an entire environment, for a good environment, bad environmental laws burden all our other human rights, because at the end of the day, we will have to limit all the other human rights and freedoms in order to combat and fight climate change. And this landmark ruling, you can find a report on this ruling under this link online. You will see it's really a very, very tough and very good ruling in favor of climate protection. And it was a ruling that actually lifted parts of the Climate Protection Act in Germany, because the act was not going far beyond, more beyond than just a couple of years. And the Constitutional Court said that actually we have to think about the future generations, and we cannot only have a perspective of 5 or 10 years for the next measures. We have to think for more years and for a longer period in order not to put all the burden on the future generations. Another landmark ruling, and one of the first climate change litigation cases, was the case of Urgenda against the Netherlands, which was a decision by the Dutch Supreme Court that gave the Netherlands the responsibility and the obligation to take more and more significant actions to reduce emissions due to the European Convention of Human Rights, namely Article 8, and said that there is a right for a healthy environment, and that Netherlands was infringing with this obligation to protect the environment for the human beings. So, we all know that our laws are partly outdated, and they're always like a little bit on a level on the time schedule, they are like behind the things that are happening in the world. So still, we have to look at the laws and try to address the climate crisis with the existing law. And we are trying to test the existing law if we can use it to combat and curb emissions, because it would take too long to wait until new laws are enacted. If you have a look at the long time it took for all the agreements, and if you see that most of these agreements are not binding, and at the end of the day, even if they are binding, the member states are not taking their responsibility and implementing the measures they should, then of course we are forced to take other steps and other measures, and we are using law as a tool with the existing law. And if we can prove that the existing law is enough, is fair enough for our actions, that's wonderful. If not, we can at least prove that they need to be adapted. As governments have failed to enforce rigorous actions on climate change, civil society is increasingly using the law or the courts to force the countries, companies, or the individuals to act, and climate lawsuits are thus another important lever to hold decision makers accountable. in the fight against climate change. Courts can, of course, redress the imbalances of power in society and give force to the rule of law. So what we did last year was the registration and building of a new nonprofit NGO, and we gave the NGO the name All Rise, like in the Anglo-American or American courts, when everybody has to stand up just before the judge declares and tells his decision or her decision. All Rise has actually the goal to develop environmental litigation initiatives to stand up against environmental destruction, putting the law in the focus of our undertakings. And we want to ensure the use of the present national, international law, utilizing cutting-edge legal and scientific expertise to fight the international dimension of environmental destruction, providing it to be a crime against humanity. We want to demonstrate that acts of major environmental destruction have serious local, regional, and global impacts, and that they are threatening health, well-being, and lives of anyone exposed to the resulting ecological disruptions, and that the damaging effects of such major environmental destruction on ecosystems like the Amazon and the biodiversity and the climate cannot be without any sanction. They cannot be for free and cannot be unpunished. We advocate for the definition of the right to a healthy environment as an autonomous human right, because it's not implemented so far as an autonomous human right in the European Convention of Human Rights or in the Charter of Human Rights of the European Union. With our NGO All Rise, nonprofit NGO All Rise, we filed in October, on October 12th of the year 2021, a criminal complaint at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, the so-called Article 15 communication due to the regulation of the Rome Statute. And we actually want the OTP, the Officer of Prosecution in The Hague, Officer of Prosecution in The Hague, to start investigations against the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and members of his government. We packed into our legal criminal complaint a report by Friederike Otto. She was in charge, she was actually the head of the Institute of Climatology in Oxford, and she was one of the main authors of the last World Climate Report. And we packed her expertise into our criminal complaint at The Hague, and you can find the full communication and the full legal criminal complaint under this link on that website. And of course, we started a campaign to help us with our criminal complaint at The Hague. And I will just let you see. So Sorry, this was a very rapid slide show, but I hope that we have a good discussion and I can go into further details about climate change and climate change litigation in the discussion.
All right, thank you. Wolfram, can you? Oh, you're sure. Yeah, now I can see it. Sorry. Yeah, thanks for the great introduction. I guess we have lots of time for questions, so please write your questions in the chat and I will moderate the discussion. So there was already one question from before from Mehdi, was if you penalize or you sue governments, then they and penalties from taxpayers' money, they then need to go back to the companies that produce it or produce most of the CO2. So would that mean that if you ask countries to stick to the rules, then they need to also implement it to the companies or individuals, I guess? Is that the kind of thinking that you set? Or because the legislation is one part of governments, but also acting on the legislation is their part. And I guess that's where they're missing out at the moment, right?
Yes, of course. As I said before, climate change litigation is a very young and very new legal field. And we've been concentrating on governments so far in order to force them to implement a better legislation. But of course, the next step will be to have a closer look at the companies, if they are actually acting as they should, if they are compliant with the legislation that has been enacted. And of course, we will have a closer look at the banks that are financing companies that are not compliant with environmental legislation, climate protection legislation. So there are thousands of lawsuits to be filed, of course, until we make a difference, but we are heading step by step.
Yeah. So next question was, I guess, from the video you showed, is what is the current status of the lawsuit against, or the Planet versus Bolsonaro?
We filed the lawsuit, or the actually criminal complaint, in October, and of course the ICC has a lot of cases to deal with, and the Office of Prosecution has to have a closer look on every complaint that is filed there. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, is a quite young court still in comparison to other courts. It's only 20 years old. And of course, it's dealing mainly with genocide, war crimes, and the third main rule is the crimes against humanity. And we are trying to prove that environmental destruction under the Rome Statute can be qualified as a crime against humanity already. There is an initiative which is called Stop Ecocide, and which is trying to implement a new criminal code or article in the Rome Statute, but that would take maybe another 10 or 12 years until all or the major part of the member states of ICC would be ready and willing to implement such a new article. And we're running out of time. So we've been asking the Office of Prosecution to have a look at our criminal complaint, or Article 15 communication. And the next step will be that the Office of Prosecution will have to decide if he is going to start so-called preliminary investigations. And that would be a major step for us, actually, a milestone if such preliminary investigations would be started. We have a new Office of Prosecution in charge. It is Mr. Karim Khan, and he's been following Fatou Bensouda. She's been in charge for 10 years and she resigned last year. And it would be actually a chance for the International Criminal Court to get a new standing in the area of climate change protection, and to give new moves actually to the discussion if environmental destruction, as we see in the Amazon, which are actually resulting in damages that might be global or which have a global impact, would be seen as crimes against humanity, not only on the local level, of course, but on the regional and the global level.
Yeah, and maybe just to follow up, Wolfram, is what would be the perfect or the perfect place for this kind of lawsuits? Would that be international courts, or would that be local, or both? Or because, as you said, it's the really big destruction is happening on a global level, so it seems relevant on a global court, but of course they have less power, I guess, to implement on something.
It's a tricky question. I think there is not always a perfect court for all cases. You can only try to find for a certain problem a perfect court. And if you want to address a national problem, of course, you will have to look at the national courts first. But if you're facing a behavior like the one of Mr. Jair Bolsonaro and his government, national courts might not help you because they are under control of the governments sometimes. So then you will need to address your lawsuits to some international courts. And it did not happen before, actually, that the International Criminal Court had to deal with environmental crimes, climate crimes of such a scale. And so we tried, okay, we said we will try, we'll try first. There have been filed some complaints at ICC against the actions and the crimes of Bolsonaro before by indigenous leaders and some lawyers of Brazil themselves. And we are trying to complement their criminal complaints. And if we could wish for something, it would be that the Office of Prosecution now actually having on his table at least three criminal complaints we know of, that he would pick up all of them and start preliminary investigations.
All right. Another question in the chat from Brandon Roos is what impact do you think giving natural features like rivers an equivalent legal status as humans can have? Is it possible for the atmosphere to also be given such rights? And would that solve something, I guess? Is there...
It's an interesting question as well, because we have a legal status for animals in our constitution in Austria as creatures we're living with, and they have sort of rights already, but I think that nobody thought of a river or a mountain or a wood to have some rights. Who would represent the river or the wood then? Who would be responsible or in charge of representing? Who would be allowed to represent it? So if we talk about legal entities, we think about human beings or other legal entities as, for instance, society, limited society. But we've not been thinking about ecosystems like a river or a wood of being a legal entity so far. But it's an interesting thought. I don't think that it might come in the near future, but it's a good thought.
Yeah. There was a question from Saroy. If you're in the UK and you want to file a lawsuit against the crime against humanity, how would you go about it? Or
against the United Kingdom or against another state?
I don't know. It's not in the, but I guess the broader question is: are there really local or national differences? Because I guess there is the big Anglo section law and
No,
then,
I can see the question in the chat now. You can
okay.
file as whoever gets notice of a crime, a genocide, war crime, or a crime against humanity, can file such a communication. You don't have to be the one that is being persecuted or killed or targeted by the state. It's enough that you have notice of a crime. And then you can ask the Office of Prosecution to have a look at your criminal complaint. So actually, you just send an email with all the facts you know about the crime, and then hope that the Office of Prosecution picks up your complaint and starts investigations. And you can do it, of course, from UK as you can do it from everywhere else on the planet.
Okay. And would there be, so you just have to send an email. This is interesting. My
of
question.
Course, we've been working quite a long time on that email, about 1.5 years, and we put about 500,000 euros into that email. But
yeah, this was my next question: is what's the team like you put together, right, with the NGO, the Allrise NGO? Because it's as you said in the talk, it's of course the legal side, but there are also scientists, experts on the climate, and one part was also having the funds for it, right? So can you give a little bit of description how that team looks like? Or
so the friend and client of mine that asked me to start this project or think about this project is Johnny Wesemann. He's been working as a manager in disruptive management areas. So he's been CEO of Uber, to give you some some understanding. And he actually wanted to do something for climate protection. And he came up with the idea, can't we sue Bolsonaro? And I said, I'm not a lawyer in Brazil, so I've not the competence to file lawsuits in Brazil at Brazilian courts, but I can think about an international court, and I don't think it makes sense to file a lawsuit against Jair Bolsonaro in Austria, because he doesn't own funds here as far as we know. So that's why we started with the thought of creating a lawsuit at an international court. Creating and filing a lawsuit at the international court, of course, needs experts at such courts. And so we got in contact with Queen's Counsel and a French colleague. And both of them had a lot of experience in front of the ICC, and we asked them to help us with the preparation and the filing of the communication. And of course, we knew from the first moment as well that we would need climatological expertise, and we would need expertise for the campaigning. And so we started to enter low bono agreements, because we thought that pro bono would be not enough to handle such a big project, and it would be too hard actually to force people then to deliver their part of work. So we asked them to work for us and tried to make fundraising for the funds needed for such a project, but always asked them to give us actually a lump sum or a discount or some low bono fees arrangements, so that we could actually make a big project with low costs.
Yeah. And how much was I mean, you said I forgot her name, the scientist in Oxford. How big was that
Friederike Otto. She was a team of 4 people actually. There was a colleague of her, Rupert Stewart from New Zealand, and 2 other team members of, I guess, of her institute of Rupert Stewart. But you can have a look at all our team members and the overall team and the advisory board on the website, theplanetversus.org. I put it into the chat. so everybody can see it. Or maybe you can put it in the, that's wrong. planetfis.org. So that's the website. Just a moment. planetversus.org, and there you get all the information about the whole team and what we did so far and what we're doing. We got an agreement with Avaz as well, which is one of the main fundraising and petition signing raising platforms. I think most of you will know Avaz, and we raised nearly 1 million of signatures for our petition on Avaz as well, and on change.org, another social media platform. We raised, I think, more than 60,000. So this is a lot of, yeah, signings and good vibes we got from all the people out there.
Yeah. And is this the future of this kind of cases, that you really build a team with multiple expertises that to really target it? And with that, I mean, we don't know yet what's gonna become of the lawsuit, but would that be like a signature for success for these cases?
We can see at the climate change litigations that have been successful that they always followed these rules and had this concept of merging expertise. Of course, you need the facts. Whenever you ask a court to give you a decision, you will have to present the facts. And as we are just lawyers, most of us don't understand the facts about climatologic happenings and things that can be proven or cannot be proven. So we followed these rules as well, and this guideline, and tried to get the expertise of, for instance, as said before, Freddy Otto, and she had one major development in her academic career. She was developing the so-called attribution theory. So she can actually calculate, for instance, what results on the local, regional, or global level some climate infringing actions might have. And she calculated for our criminal complaint at The Hague that just out of the behavior of Jair Bolsonaro and his destruction policies of Amazon, we will have 180,000 premature deaths until 2080 in the whole world. So that is an astonishing number of premature death, 180,000. And it's been calculated by the report of Freddy Otto in our criminal complaint that this is just a result of the destruction measures taken by Bolsonaro in Amazon, in the Brazilian part of Amazon.
All right. There's one more question from Valeria. I guess since you had a big emphasis on public engagement, her question is civil disobedience actions also going along lawsuits? Is there any connection there at the moment, or I mean?
Not yet. So we are not maybe a typical NGO. So we did not organize some big demonstrations, and we did not connect so far with other big NGOs as like system change or climate change NGOs that are focusing on civil disobedience actions, but that might bring the future. So we are trying to foster our connections with other NGOs or other climate change litigation experts. And of course, one comes to the other. We are in connection with the organizations that filed the other communications from Brazil. We are in communication with the initiative Stop Ecocide. And we are in communication with a lot of other NGOs on the national and global level. So of course, that could be and should be combined in the future.
Yeah. Okay. If there are no further questions in the chat, I'll have two more. So what's the timeline you think for the Bolsonaro case? Do you have any idea on that, or is this gonna be accompanying you for the rest of your life, or is it gonna be?
Probably I will not travel to Brazil in the next couple of months or years. I might be shot there. So last year there have been, I think, more than 35 environmental protectors and journalists have been shot only in 2021 in Brazil. But the timeline, of course, for the whole project might be longer. We hope that we will get a response by the Office of Prosecution in the next couple of weeks already, or at least this year. And it would be, as told before, a major milestone for us if the Office of Prosecution would enter into preliminary investigations. We are in discussion in connection with some small island states, because that might be a chance or a possibility to force the Office of Prosecution to start such investigations if a member state of the ICC asks the Office of Prosecution to pick up a case, then the Office of Prosecution has to pick up the case. And of course, there are some states, small island states in the world, which are threatened a lot by climate change, as for instance, Vanuatu or Samoa or Trinidad and Tobago. And if we might get their help and a so-called state referral, state party referral, then the court and the Office of Prosecution actually might act earlier. We're working on that.
And then once it's accepted, then it would still take quite a long time, I guess. Or...
Then it might still take some years, because of course the defense can then bring forward its arguments, and of course there might be a hearing. At the end of the day, of course, it would be wonderful if there would be a ruling of the court on the case. Nevertheless, I think it even is a win-win situation for us, even if the court would decide that the Rome Statute is not actually giving us the right nowadays to file such lawsuits. Then we might then rise the pressure, and at the end of the day, it might result in a new article in the Rome Statute. So either we can prove that the Rome Statute is fit for such cases, or we can prove it's not, then it has to be changed. And we will try to raise the pressure continuously to the court and to the public and to those who are in charge and responsible.
Yeah, and then I have one final question. Are there any national or international other cases to look out for that we should support?
There is a very interesting case of, I think, Portuguese students, a case filed at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and they are asking the European Court of Human Rights to make a decision against their home country, Portugal, for not implementing more climate protection laws and acting more climate protection laws. We will, of course, we are thinking of other initiatives on the national or European level. We have been looking with Bolsonaro, very bad guy, on the on the support line, or on the area where does the cheap meat and where does the cheap soy come from. And at the end of the day, we will have to have a closer look as well on the companies in Europe which are producing the meat, buying the cheap meat in Brazil. So not only the supply chain is important, but also the consumers and the companies which are delivering to the consumers. We will have to have a closer look on the banks, which are under green finance measures, are still financing such projects and such companies, and we will keep the pressure high. At the end of the day, we will get new tools in 2023. There will be the possibility, at least in Europe, to file some collective redress or some lawsuits as class actions in the United States. We did not have this possibility before, and it was one of the major goals of my class action for Mr. Max Schrems against Facebook. At that time, the European Court of Justice told us there is no way for class actions in Europe so far, and the court told us that it's not the competence of the court to implement such legal acts. And as a result of the decision of ECJ in the Max Schrems case, actually, we have enacted the collective redress directive, which will be actually working and alive in 2023. So then we will have the chance to file class actions or collective redress lawsuits at the beginning of January 2023. And you can guess that I'm thinking of such actions already.
Super. Cool.